This is the Neurosurgery Podcast.
So I think the simplest place to start, what is good, what is evil?
Yeah, so I certainly don't have any capture on this definition better than anybody else. Everybody has their own definition, but I think that broadly, you could talk about, well, what is evil, right? You could talk about evil in two different categories. Maybe is the best way to do this. There is what most people know as evil, which is, they call it like moral evil.
Yeah.
So in other words, there's an intent of malice or truly horrendous neglect. And the idea being that there is some sort of a conscious, spiritual, emotive quality to something associated with an untoward outcome. And then there's a different kind of evil, which is more on the gray line. This is where it's hard when you deal with, say, medical malpractice or personal injury attorneys. And there's this concept of a different kind of evil, which is, I think some people call it like natural evil, which is like a hurricane hits Miami and then lots of people die. Well, some people probably blame global warming. So let's instead use an example like an asteroid strikes the Earth, and that's evil. So people say, well, that's a horrible thing. Is it truly evil?
Right.
Is a tiger eating a prey animal? Is that evil? Right. So that's what they mean by natural evil. So for us, I think the way you'd break it down is you have a complication. That's bad. People get hurt. There's negative consequences on all fronts. Is that evil? Or does evil arise when there is either malicious intent, poor indications, lack of training, neglect, not answering your phone, not seeing the patient, not being properly prepared, showing up to the OR drunk, whatever it is? Is that the definition of where you cross the border into evil?
Yeah.
I mean, how do you feel about that?
So that it's interesting. I will say at the outset of this good and evil series of conversations we're going to have, this is, as always, unscripted, but I've prepared kind of an outline for this. I've been studying a lot for it, and in no way have Dr. Wang and I compared notes.
Yeah.
So
nothing.
it's very interesting to me that I asked you what are good and evil, and you immediately go toward evil, because in my own preparation for this and thinking about it over the past couple of months, I think it's much easier to define evil than good. And we're going to try in this conversation to define both to set the stage for the subsequent episodes. But I think it's much easier to define evil. So I think it's interesting that you also went in that direction immediately. And I agree, there is a stark difference between things that are bad and evil. I think evil requires agency, like you were talking about. The simplest, purest phrase I could come up with for evil is deliberately causing unnecessary harm.
But can I ask you about that then?
Yeah.
Does it require intent? In other words, what if someone's just hardwired to be predatory, like a predatory animal, right?
Yeah.
How does that play into
I don't think animals can do evil. I think it requires agency, and at least me, from my life experience and scientific training, I don't think animals have agency.
a soul, so to speak?
You could say
A
that.
scientific
right.
version of a soul? Okay.
That's right. That's one way to put it. And so there are bad things like an asteroid hitting the Earth. There are bad things like having a complication. Let's say an avoidable complication. Let's say your hand slips. I guess I don't know if you would call that avoidable, but I don't mean like there's a reaction to anesthesia that you couldn't have anticipated, but there's bad outcome from it. I mean, you make a technical error during surgery. I think that's bad. I don't think that's evil.
So is it then true that evil becomes more intimately associated with greater levels of intelligence, involvement, capability, et cetera, et cetera? In other words, the passivity of, let's say someone's, they used to say simple, right?
Yeah.
Someone has a very low IQ and they do things that have very negative untoward consequences.
Yeah.
Does that cross into evil?
Not to me. I think that that's harmful. I think it's bad. I think it's awful. I think it's suboptimal. But evil, to me, I think requires will, you're causing harm, and it's unnecessary harm. You know, we hurt people. We cut them, right? Physicians all around give medications with side effects, and there's the risk-benefit analysis. There's the side effect. You really look at chemotherapy, right? That hurts people, but you're doing harm, but it's net a benefit. So it's a necessary harm.
So your definition is interesting because if you were to say neurosurgery and maybe cardiothoracic surgery are the apex of medicine in a lot of ways, and not to discount other doctors, but
complexity, invasiveness, fundamental systems of the body.
Stakes are the highest.
Yes.
Right? And in real time.
Yeah.
Then the greatest capacity for evil lies in those fields. And it would make sense because, in other words, if what you do is you're a phlebotomist and you show up every morning, you're drawing blood. I know it's not a doctor, right? But let's say you're a nurse practitioner, one step up from that. You're just adhering to protocols. And then one step up from that, you're just a general internist that adheres to the protocols that New England Journal releases about blood pressure medicines, et cetera, and everything complicated, you get a consult.
Yeah.
Then your capacity for evil is necessarily much more restricted.
The capacity for the impact of your evil is greater, but evil's evil, to me at least.
Okay.
But it's, you could have a bazooka or you could have a 9mm and you're still shooting a gun.
Well, sins of omission and commission then. So if I fail to treat someone's hypertension and they have an intracranial hemorrhage, and let's just say that there was a proximate relationship, right? Is that the same thing as inducing an intracranial hemorrhage with a scalpel blade or an instrument?
If in both cases you deliberately induced it or deliberately didn't treat it, hoping that they would have a hemorrhage, both are evil.
So I have this problem. I'm so glad we have video now.
Yeah.
So this is a picture. I'll bring it a little closer. So this is a picture in 2006 at the Congress of Neurosurgeons.
When I was 14.
This is at the Peninsula Hotel in Chicago, where JP lives. And this is a picture of George Lucas with my 3 children. They were very young at the time. Sarah was 2, Evan was 4, Patrick was 6. And I have to shout out to Michael Puzo, who's my neurosurgical father, who organized George Lucas as one of the first puzzle creativity lecturers at the Congress of Neurosurgeons meeting. And I put this up here as a prop because we're at my home. I love this picture because to many people, George Lucas kind of helped them define concepts of good and evil, for better or worse, through the Star Wars original trilogy, but now like universe, right? And so let's go to that. So because that's a constant discussion about, well, these players, these Jedi, these Siths, right? Are the Sith all evil and the Jedi all good, right? And it's getting more complex.
Right, and so the mythology of Star Wars, and really even just the plot structure of it, is based on the story cycle which Joseph Campbell described in A Hero with a Thousand Faces, which are an archetypal hero's journey, which has certain beats: loss of a mentor, like when Obi-Wan dies, descent to the underworld, which is the lowest point, and then return. And it's a psychological process that he argues people go through when coming to adulthood and finding your place and your identity. Also, it harkens back to an older way that humans used to live, because the story cycle, you begin as a young man. It's a hero's journey from a male's perspective, the way it's classically described. You begin as a young man in your village. You leave your home and security, descend to the underworld, the unknown, find new knowledge, and come back changed. Either you bring back knowledge, you bring back a magical relic, you achieve some new capacity, and you come back to your home a changed, better, actualized adult individual, and thus enrich your community. And that shape of that story, he drew a lot from the work of Carl Jung as well, who described these archetypes and these patterns underlying all of our stories. Again, can be an internal psychological struggle, or it could be the course through a career, perhaps, where, as we often talk about, when you're going through training, you kind of descend into an underworld where you're unmade and you're taken apart, and then you rise from it something different, something better.
Is this what the Mormons do in the Amish, like when they send people away for a time?
Well, Springer. That's the that's the Amish one, right? You leave your community,
right,
and you come back, hopefully bringing something from outside. And so that's what he based the plot of Luke Skywalker's story through these movies on, but then also the concept of the light and the dark, which is obviously very relevant to this conversation. Again, kind of drawing from the work of Carl Jung, who said that within each of us there is a light and a dark side, the shadow self. And Jung argued that rather than try to banish the, maybe not evil, but the more aggressive, animalistic, potentially evil side of ourselves, the selfish, the aggressive, the violent, you could integrate that into your personality and channel that as a healthy energy to slay dragons, for example, or just to divert that energy toward a useful goal.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as it relates to neurosurgery, I'm constantly reminded of, one of my favorite movies and books, American Sniper.
Yeah.
Chris Kyle, right? And for anybody who hasn't seen that movie, I just assigned it to our fellows to watch this weekend, which shocked me they hadn't seen it. But at the beginning of the movie, Chris Kyle and his brother are growing up, and his brother steals something or whatever, and gets in a fight and all that, and his dad makes this statement, right, at the family table, and they're in Texas, right? In the world, there's three kinds of people. There's sheep, there's wolves, and there's sheepdogs. And the idea being that being a sheep is easy. You're a prey animal. You don't have to do anything really. You just eat, reproduce, and there's not a lot of discussion of stuff like this. Then there are wolves. Wolves are predatory, and in the story, Chris Kyle's father says, "If you're a wolf, I'll kill you myself." And those are the truly evil people, at least in a very binary sense.
Yeah.
And then there's sheepdogs that have to harness that ability to be violent, aggressive, be able to take a stand. There's a physicality or an emotional tenor to it to defend the sheep against the wolves.
Yeah.
And I think in neurosurgery training, we really are looking to build that feature in people's personalities.
Yeah. And what is a sheepdog? What is a dog but a wolf?
A tamed wolf.
Right. Nietzsche wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, society tames the wolf into the dog, and man is the most domesticated animal of all. And so that, again, speaks to finding that dark side, potentially dark side within yourself, and using it to become, Jordan Peterson often says, a useful monster, right?
Yeah.
You should have the capacity to do good or evil and then channel it towards the good. What is a rifle? It's a tool for throwing a projectile. You point at a good person, you're a bad guy. You point at a bad person, you're a good guy. And I think that the key between those two paths that you could walk, good versus evil, light side versus dark side, and even going back to our attempted definition of evil, is agency. And so let's really get out there. Dr. Wang, do you believe in free will?
Yeah, that's a very interesting concept, especially now that the first Neuralink has been implanted, right? And hopefully, shout out to Seth Tigachar, one of our residents who went to Stanford Medical School, and trying to get us to be maybe the second site, maybe a third site for Neuralink. So it's very exciting. I mean, this examination of who we are, what we are, and what makes us up. If you believe in a quantum physics scenario and the multiple possibilities of universes and all that, I mean, you really are just saying, well, these are probabilities, right? The probabilities that these neurons are behaving this way to make you think a certain thing or act a certain way, then there really isn't what they call free will, except for a freewheeling type of process that is being driven by the finger on the scale, the thumb on the scale of evolution, which is these are being selected for, these are the favorable characteristics. But I think that personally, we as Americans subscribe to the concept that there has to be such a thing as free will. In other words, how else do we, make judgments and determinations about individuals and actions? That's the first thing. And the second, how do we even have a hope to influence anything?
Yeah.
So if you're an optimist, I would say, you have to believe in free will, because you have to say that there's an opportunity for that affirmative psychological or behavioral manifestation to be altered in a direction that's favorable, right? So there's good and evil, there's favorable, unfavorable. Everybody wants favorable all the time. So yes, I mean, I believe in free will. I believe that my psychological construct of the world relies on it. If I didn't believe in it, then I would descend into nihilism, because then what is the purpose of us even talking today?
Yeah,
Right?
and we never really talked about things like this over the years. Most of my adult life, I did not believe in free will.
Really?
And again, here's the cognitive dissonance coming in. I'm the most individualistic, freedom, liberty loving, aggressive, I buck authority person you've ever met. But and I used to have this partition in my mind where I had the rationalist, materialist, my ideas about reality. And then I had my ideas and beliefs about my experience and how I would live. And I was able to completely partition that, and I thought to myself, with a rationalist, materialist view of the physical universe, free will is not physically possible. How does an electron choose to move, right? Newton's laws, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. There's nothing but reactions, right? Electron moves, a neuron fires. How could there possibly be a physical mechanism for me to influence particles moving through the whirlwind of space? Even though my lived experience is what it is, and I had a partition. And then, really, like months ago, this calendar year, I was thinking about it again, and I kind of just threw that away. Because science, I think, is really good at answering scientific questions. The scientific method is good at reproducibly predicting, if you mix two chemicals, what comes out of it, or particle accelerators, or, there are questions that are ideal for the scientific method and a scientific, rationalist, materialist worldview, physical questions. But I was again thinking about Newton, and he described the law of gravity. And his law of gravity didn't explain how gravity worked. It observed it empirically,
Right.
and gave descriptions of the attractive force.
It's a predictive model.
There was no mechanism.
Yeah.
It just said, if these things are this far apart, this is how much they pull, and so you can predict it will go there, and it worked. But there was absolutely no explanation of how gravity happened, just observe that it did. Until centuries later, Einstein described the space-time continuum and the fabric of space-time, and kind of gave a model for why gravity happened. And I was thinking about that, and thinking about that, and thinking about this belief I've been living under for 15 years or whatever, that there's no physical explanation for how free will could work, therefore it must not be real. And I thought, well, I experience it, right? Like, what's the most rationalist, empiric perspective you can take? I experience something moment to moment in my life. Just because we don't have a physical mechanism for how it could be possible yet, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not possible. It just means we haven't described it yet.
So can I ask you, and it may be too personal, but what was the impetus? What was the catalyst for this? It's a pretty phenomenal change in a person's way of thinking about things, right? I mean,
Yeah.
What was the catalyst?
There wasn't an aha moment. I don't even remember what day. I just kind of got there. Honestly, I've been thinking about things like this in the past few months, preparing for this series. I've been reading a lot, contemplating things, and I think I hadn't revisited my belief about the possibility of free will in years. It was just back there, in the basement of my operating system, so to speak. And so I hadn't really taken it out and thought about it again since I was 20-something.
The funny thing about this, and I can see where you're coming at this, because the funny thing about evil is that evil people don't perceive themselves as evil. Right? So then the question is it relativistic? In other words, I'm not sure that, okay, let's just go to the most extreme, right? Take someone like Adolf Hitler, right? Okay? If you were Adolf Hitler's psychologist or psychiatrist, okay, and you did a objective, analysis of this person. Let's say you didn't even know the person's actions. Let's say this person shows up and he's got a funny little mustache and he's laying on your couch and you're talking to him. Do you think that the psychiatrist or psychologist would necessarily come to the conclusion that this person, not whether they're evil or not, perceived himself as being an evil person?
Almost certainly not.
Right?
Right. No, he
That's-
thought he was a hero.
Right. And so this is where it becomes really intersectional to neurosurgery. Like, in other words, I see so much neurosurgical evil. When I say that, I mean, there are little tidbits here, right? Someone's doing this way that, and it's not a matter of judgment. It's like, this person didn't need surgery. It's pretty clear. Or, and we know why they did the surgery, right? Or, this person needed surgery and you told them not, out of fear or whatever, right? Neglect, you didn't like the patient. Or you build extra, right? Okay. So these are small snippets of evil, and I know the impact can be big to the patient, right? Okay, it can be, of course. And by the way, open disclosure for this, I have lots of complications. I have lots of problems. I have patients who don't like me. I have untoward events. I'm not perfect. I've done lots of things that I'm not totally proud of, but I do try to make a conscious effort to do the right thing. Okay,
right.
So this is for the audience, like, I'm not taking, like, I'm holier than thou, even though I really focus on this. And would you like to make a disclaimer as well, or?
Of course.
Okay.
I mean, we're all.
Yeah, just so people don't get the
pilgrims
wrong
on the
idea
road,
about this,
right.
yeah.
No, but I mean, I would think and hope that disclaimer is built in to having
Yes.
conversations about this, but it's.
But you never know.
But, right, important to say explicitly, we're all pilgrims on the road trying to examine these things, and I think it's okay to talk about what is ideal and what is the opposite of ideal without painting ourselves as some judge.
Yes.
Right? We're not in a position of judgment or arbiters of good and evil. We're people thinking about it in our lives.
So how is it that we find that neurosurgery has so much evil in its midst? In other words, like, I mean, we could break down the kinds of evil that we see, and I don't have a complete cataloging, but obviously sins of commission, omission, financial motive,
Yeah.
fear motive, incompetence motive, meaning you're just telling people, like, you don't need a surgery because I don't know how to do it, but you're not saying that because
Yeah.
of pride. You're like, nothing's going to help you, but
Yeah.
you don't really believe that. There's so many ways, right? Not training your trainees, leading them astray, lying to patients about stuff that you shouldn't lie about, right? Not in their benefit. I mean, there's so many ways to deal with this. Taking apart systems that don't
Yeah.
need to be taken apart. We see that in a lot of places out of jealousy, hurting other surgeons that are trying to do good work. Why do we even talk about it? Like, I don't suspect there's an ENT podcast discussing evil in ENT. Like, I just don't, not that they don't have problems,
Right.
but I'll give you an example. I was called into the OR upstairs. They said, Dr. White, come up to see this patient. And they asked me to scrub in, and they were doing another doobie mosquito. I got it.
You killed the bug. Was that
Yeah,
evil?
killed them. All right, yeah, Buddhists would say that's evil. Sorry, it's like my house is full of mosquitoes. The ENT doctor said, oh, yeah, we see some invasion of the spine from this tumor. I'm like, well, that's funny because I'm looking right at the spine. And they go, oh, yeah, that's okay because the pharynx is over here on the back table. And they had removed the entirety of the patient's esophagus, trachea, all of that, like, through a segment, and they were preparing to re-anastomose it. And I was looking at it like, people are scared of the surgeries. I do?
Wow.
And we're just looking at the spine, like skin,
Yeah.
spine. I'm like, okay, well, don't worry about the spine. There's nothing to do here. Just let me curette some tumor out. You guys finish doing what you need to do.
Yeah.
And I was like, fucking A. Like, and the ENT doctors agree. They're like, that's the thing to do, right? Now, why do we have so much of this evil adjacent type of discussion? Is it the nature of us? Is it the nature of our field? Is it the environment we're in? Is it there's too much money in what we do? Like, what is it?
I think, obviously it's a mix, but I do think that the nature of our work, both the life and death aspect of it sometimes, the severity of our critical patients, the quality of life functional implications for a lot of the disease, and then the kind of person who is attracted to that sort of work, not just interested in the nervous system, and so thought, consciousness, that attracts a lot of people, but interested in working on the nervous system and signing up to deal with those kinds of patients. I think there is kind of a heterodyning effect where the work fundamentally deals with the organ that gives us thoughts, and it attracts a person who has the interest in that organ and the personality and the will to do things to it. And if you're at all reflective and think about your day-to-day life, this is the environment that you're in mentally and psychologically. These are the things that you think about. In terms of cataloging evil, we are in this coming series of discussions. This is gonna be structured not for any kind of favoritism, but just because it's a convenient historic way to structure things. This series is going to be based around the 7 deadly sins and their corresponding cardinal virtues. And I think this is an interesting place to wrap up this introductory conversation, because the sins and virtues are not actions. They're motivations for actions. You know, pride, gluttony, lust. These are, you don't walk out and pride. It's not a verb. It's a motivation behind a potential sinful action that is born of pride or envy or anger. They're motivating mental states, spiritual states behind potential harms we can do. And so we're going to examine those different facets and categories of evil in our lives. To wrap this up then, we've talked about will, because there can be no good nor evil without will. We've talked about evil. What then is good? Because it would be easy to sit back and just say, well, good is the absence of evil, right? Even though, interestingly, in the history of theology and philosophy, it's more common that people say evil is the absence of good. Or 1,000 years ago, evil is the absence of God, whichever religion. Evil is defined as that which is not our God and our law. So with our definition of evil, which seems so much easier to wrap our minds around, it would be easier to just say, oh, well, good is anything that's not that. But just like there are bad things and evil things, in the realm of good, another Peterson quote that I love, he said, a hero is something positive, not just the absence of evil. Positive not meaning in a good sense, positive meaning in an active or substantive sense. It's not just the absence of evil, it's something you have to be and to do. And so someone who, we say this a lot in residency, if you show up on time, do your job, and don't lie, you're a great resident, right? So you could be an accountant, a plumber, a surgeon, a governor, a banker, a mom. If you show up and do what you're supposed to do each day, that's good, right? But clearly there's a difference between that and someone who heroically throws himself on top of his wife and kids when bullets are flying.
Well, I think it's interesting because context matters here. I think that part of this discussion is, we're in the first world, right?
Yeah.
So we tend to focus on the evil because our lives are generally quite decent.
Yes.
But I think if you were to go into the impoverished context, whatever that means, resource impoverished or otherwise, good stands out much more starkly, because you could argue that the entire system in some ways is built for some good. That's the motivation. In other words, I want to take away things like global warming and unexpected consequences of what we do. But by and large, most of what's happening in our systems is directed towards good, right? Safety, comfort, right?
Yeah.
Resources, nutrition, right? Support, right? And so we live in this great world where we don't necessarily find ourselves being forced to define good until things are really bad. Like you said, like in the shooting where someone does this heroic act. And so just the absence of evil makes things quite acceptable. But I think that context changes very quickly when you enter a different arena. And you could say that maybe that's where neurosurgeons intersect with good. In other words, someone who has normal pressure hydrocephalus, they're demented, they're urinating on themselves, they can't walk, nobody can figure this out, right? And you fix that for them because they've really entered for their personal life a very different scenario than what you and I are experiencing right now. And then the good becomes very apparent.
Yes.
Right? And that's one of the things that I think is so positive about neurosurgery. In other words, I tend to focus like you on the evil, like, oh, this person did a bad thing. But then you look at let's call them miracles.
Yeah.
People every day say it's a miracle. And in a way, actually, it is a miracle. I mean, that's not the wrong noun to describe what happened. It's not necessarily an act of spirituality, it could be an act of science. But that opportunity for good is, I want to believe that's what drives people to neurosurgery.
Yeah.
Now, how does it end up being attracting so much evil, right? So that to me is like it's the capacity for good and evil is so elevated.
Right. And what I've come to, I haven't come up with a pithy distilled phrase like for evil, intentionally causing unnecessary harm. But to me, just as there are bad things and then evil with a capital E, there are good things, just doing your job, not hurting any, doing that which is expected of you. I think this is the closest I could come to. That which is expected of you, that's good, lowercase g. And I think, at least for my contemplations and the conversations we're about to have, the counterpoint and the opposite of evil with a capital E is not good, but it's being a hero and being heroic. Because if you say good with a lowercase g is doing that which is expected, being heroic is going past that.
Yeah.
It almost always involves self-sacrifice. We always say going above and beyond. These are things in our lexicon, right? And I think a field that opens people's heads and attracts people that have the will to do that and the interest to do it are obviously people with that surgeon's mindset, have the capacity to go in either direction. But just as being evil, doing a thing that is evil requires agency, something that is heroic requires a setting for heroism, right? As you said, living in the first world, I think there's less opportunity to be heroic because there aren't as many dragons to slay. And so there's everyday heroism, and in all of our lives, people make sacrifices for their children, people make sacrifices to their present self for their future self in education and training. But to really step up and be a hero in a classical sense, you need the opportunity to do so. And I think neurosurgery attracts people that want that. We want to slay dragons.
Yeah.
And so we come to where the dragons are, right? And we're going to be examining the various opportunities we have to fall short of that opportunity or to succeed.
So tune in.